In this video, I'm going to show you how I QA designs. I'm going to focus more on desktop designs, but many of these things apply to mobile as well, with a few special caveats that I'll get into in another video. To start out, you're going to need a couple of things. The first is the Zeppelin desktop app. Now, you can use the web-based app for 99% of everything, but I'm going to recommend using the desktop app for one special reason that I'll show later. Some of you may already know what this is, and if you do, don't spoil the surprise for everyone else. To get the desktop app, head on over to zeppelin.io, then scroll all the way down to the bottom. The links for Windows or Mac are going to be in the footer. The second thing is obviously your browser. I'm going to recommend using a chromium-based browser like Chrome, Edge, or Brave because of how the dev tools work. So far, we haven't had to standardize using one browser over another. I generally use Chrome as my daily driver and Edge for QA work so that I can force Edge to open directly in an incognito or in private browsing session. In a separate video, I'll also show an extension I would highly suggest you install and start using called Measure Everything, which is awesome, and I'll show you why in that video. Here's how I QA design. If you review your design the same way I'm going to QA, I would guess that most of the time everything will match. I do, however, realize there are certain requirements that mean you may not be able to build it exactly how it's laid out in the design. To begin with, our designs start as one of two screen widths or sizes. For mobile, that's 375 pixels, and for desktop, it's 1440 pixels. Green Compass is a special case since we inherited their designs from another design team. But for all designs that start with us, it will be one of those two sizes I mentioned. The other thing to consider is the height of the page you're working on. I found that it can vary depending on the section of the site or app, but for admin portals particularly, which is what I'm going to show in this video, most pages will be what I would consider the default height of the site, which in this case is 1024. I'm basing this off of several different screens. The first is the login screen. From there, I'm looking at the remaining screens that don't require the user to scroll because the content, which in most cases is a table, is a fixed height to start with. Here's how to tell the width and height of a screen. Look at Zeppelin and find the screen you're going to work on. I'll grab the login screen since that's handy. Right-click anywhere on the design and select the top layer. And this should look very familiar from the layers, padding, and gaps video. On the right-hand side, I can see the width of this screen is 1440 and the height is 1024. I'll reuse this same technique later when digging into components some more. Now that I have this, I'm going to head on over to my browser. You'll notice my browser is unusually wide, and that's for good reason. When I open the developer tools to inspect it, my main viewport is going to get squeezed down. Then I adjust the width and height of my viewport until it matches the 1440 by 1024 measurement I mentioned a moment ago. In the top right corner, you can see what's going to be set to. Here you can see 1443, 41 by 1024, and with a little bit of fiddling, you can get it to line up just right. You could, of course, use the device toolbar and then set it using responsive, but there are a couple of reasons I don't typically do this for desktop. The first is that the toolbar and sizing bars take up extra space here. You also notice that because of the size of my viewport here, when I set it to 1440 by 1024, it's only at 75%. If I set this all the way out to 100, then it doesn't fit and I have to resize my browser anyway. The second is that for one of the other tools I use, I have to remember to enable the device type menu, which is right here. It's actually fairly easy to do. If you click on this menu and this is missing, you can click on this and select add device type. If I set this to desktop, you'll see I get a pointer instead of a gray touch dot, and things will behave as they would on a desktop website. Now, I prefer to have my developer tools docked on the right hand side because I find it easier when scrolling up and down through a long list of page elements or styles over having them docked on the bottom. You can of course change the placement of this by selecting this little three dot menu here and choosing one of these other dock side options. I don't need the console open, so I can close that. And the last thing I want to do is show the computed style sidebar. What I primarily use this for is to show an elements box model. You can see that if you scroll down on the Styles tab or if you select Computed, but I don't want to have to bounce back and forth between those two, So I find it easiest just to turn this on right here. You see now I get basically 3 columns of information. With that out of the way, we can begin to look at a page or a component. In this example, I'm going to show a pop-up. And for this one, I picked the Add FAQ pop-up since it's one I need to QA anyway. I'm going to head over to my browser, find the pop-up, and pull it up. To make things easier to see, I'm going to zoom in to 200% here. Now I get it, no one's going to use the site like this, but it makes it easy to see where the differences may be. And since this isn't a whole page and just a pop-up, I can get away with zooming in this much. Now I'm going to find the pop-up in Zeppelin and do the same thing. And in our particular case, zoomed into 200%, it stays inside my window without having to scroll around, which is nice. If I bounce back and forth with Zeppelin and the site, I can see that things look pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and take this text out since it's not in the design. If there is text in the design, a lot of times I'll change it on the site to match since it makes it easier to line things up and tell where it's off. And now, here is where the magic happens. This is why you want to use the desktop app for Zeppelin and not your browser for this one specific thing. In the bottom left corner, nestled between the zoom and the component, is this little guy. Pop screen out. So let's do that. Selecting pop screen out gives me this neat little overlay that I can drag around and put over my site to see how close the implementation is to the design. I can zoom in and out, and I can change the opacity so I can compare my design to the site fairly easily. And since we're at 200%, I'll set it back to that. Now if I lay this over the site, we can start to look at things. What's nice is that I can nudge it around with the arrow keys on my keyboard and get it lined up just right. It may be hard to see, but as I get really close to where I want, I can bump it down and then back up, or left and right, to see the background peek out from behind the overlay just a bit and then bump it back until it's just right. And we see that we have a few issues. Now, I'll freely admit that most of the issues are minor. They won't impact the functionality at all, but we missed the mark a little getting this to match the design, and that's the whole point of the video. Taking a quick look, I can see that all of our fonts pretty much match, which means most of what we're going to look at is just spacing. If they didn't, I would look at Zeppelin and figure out what's different and note it in the ticket by looking at the typeface that's requested. And here's where I start. I sort of have to reverse engineer this. So if I go back to Zeppelin and slowly move my mouse around, I can start to see how the pieces fit together. And if I look, I can see that there are basically 5 main parts. I have the background, I have this header with the close button in it, I have an input box with a label, and I have the tiny MCE box with a label, and I have these buttons. You can see that as I move my mouse around and hover over things, the blue line moves just like I showed in the layers, padding, and gaps video. I'm going to right click and select this second to last layer. If I scroll down here, I can see that the pop-up has an 8 pixel border radius as well as a box shadow. In my browser, looking at the styles for the pop-up, I can see the border radius but not the box shadow, so I'll make a note of that for my ticket. The next thing I'm going to do is look at the spacing between all of my parts since I know things are off a little bit. Starting with the header and the close button, I can do one of two things. If I click on the header text, I can see how it relates to the next closest elements around it. If I right click on the header text and see the layer structure, the next layer up is the H stack or horizontal stack, which is the parent layer of the Add FAQ header text. The close button looks like it sits inside the H stack as well, but we'll have to see how the page was made to make a suggestion on how to move it if we need to. The H stack also shows me that it has a solid 1 pixel bottom border. It's very subtle in the design, but it's there, so I'll make a mental note of that. Mousing down to the header input label, I see that same 24 pixel gap I showed in the layers, padding, and gaps video. Now I want to look at the next part, which is the header inputs box and label. What I'm going to do is move down the page, just looking at where the different elements are and when they get highlighted. Remember, we know our padding and gap between our main elements. What I'm most interested in is seeing if there are any other little gaps between other things. So here I see between the header and the input box there's a 4 pixel gap, and we have 24 pixel gap between the body label and the header input box. Select that and move down. I see a 4 pixel gap between the body input label and the tiny MCE box, and between tiny MCE and the buttons I see that last 24 pixel gap. Now that we've taken a quick look around, we can start to fix things. I'm going to right click on Add FAQ and then select the next layer up, the H stack. It looks like it has 4 pixels of padding or margin above and below it. The close icon says 4 pixels for it, but if I click on it, I can see that I get 20 pixels from the top and 16 pixels from the right side. The H stack also shows me that there's a 1 pixel gray border on the bottom of it. Looking in my browser, I can see there's no padding or margin on the header. The close icon only has 16 pixels to top margin, and there's a horizontal rule. And that's okay as long as we can account for the spacing difference. But it looks like we have 8 pixels here of margin instead of 4. Now I'll start to update the CSS and try to get things to match. Since the horizontal rule is there, I'm going to keep it for now and just add the top margin or padding. Now I'll be honest, I can't recall when you should use which, but you just have to decide which gives you the correct layout without messing everything else up. A lot of these other elements have margins, so I'm going to go with that. So let's see. Our header needs 4 pixels of top margin. The icon needs 20 pixels of top margin. Let's move on to the horizontal rule. I'm going to set this to 2 pixels of top margin because remember, borders take up some of our space, and in this case the horizontal rule has 2 pixels of border. Okay, moving on down, I remember that we need 24 pixels of gap between each element. So this margin here should be 24. And it looks like this is sitting right on the input box, but should it be? Zeppelin says no. There should be 4 pixels of gap between these two things. So back over in our browser, we will add 4 pixels of bottom margin here. You could also do 4 pixel top margin on the input, but I think 6s here is just as long as you're consistent. Now our tiny MCE header. Okay, we have to do the same to reduce the 28 pixel of top margin down to 24. And it already has the 4 pixel bottom margin, so that's good. Now normally for tiny MCE I wouldn't worry about it too much, but for the sake of the demo I'm going to go ahead and actually set it to the correct height. So let's take a look here. This says it's 200 pixels. And what's interesting is in the design here, if you look, it actually says that it is 198.5 pixels. So just for the sake of doing it and being thorough, I'm going to set this to 198.5 pixels. The bottom margin for our buttons says that it has 24 pixels, which is very good, and the buttons themselves should be 40 pixels tall, and it looks like they are. One thing to note here though, if you look, you can see that the outline for the outline button actually goes beyond the 40 pixel height. Now this is a component which I know needs to be updated, so I'm going to ignore it. However, if you're the developer and you're looking at this, you better ask some questions about why this looks weird and talk to a few people before you just override it. For the sake of my demo and to make everything match, I'm going to do just that though. I'll add our padding. I can actually turn the outline off, and I am going to add this 2 pixel solid border. Okay, now if we look at the overlay one more time and nudge it around a little bit, we can see that things look pretty good. I'm sure there are one or two things we could tweak at the component level, but dang, look at that. All of the things I did here were just to demonstrate how we can better interpret the designs. And honestly, the most powerful thing here is the overlay. Lets you plop the design right on top of what you made and really start looking at where things are off and get them dialed in. Again, I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know, and we'll see you in the next one.